It began on a quiet Saturday morning in a neighborhood that prided itself on peace, order, and manicured lawns. The kind of neighborhood where people waved politely but kept their doors locked tight. For most, it was the dream of suburban America. But for Marcus Reed, it was more than just a neighborhood. It was his home, a place he had worked his entire life to provide for his wife and two children. He was proud of the two-story house on the corner, proud of the basketball hoop in the driveway, proud of the American flag that waved from his porch. Yet even in the calm of suburbia, Marcus knew that being a black man in America came with risks that didn't disappear once you crossed into the gates of a homeowners association. Marcus had spent the better part of his career fighting battles that most people only read about in headlines. He wasn't just another resident. He was one of the FBI's most decorated undercover agents. For years, he had infiltrated dangerous networks, drug cartels, terror cells, human trafficking rings, always with precision, always with courage. He had earned the respect of his colleagues, the trust of his country, and the scars of a man who had seen too much. But none of that mattered to the people who only saw the color of his skin. That morning, Marcus was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reviewing case notes for an operation that had nearly cost him his life just months earlier. His wife, Naomi, was upstairs getting their kids ready for soccer practice. It was ordinary. It was safe, until the sound of heavy boots crunched down his driveway. He glanced out the window and froze. Four men stood outside, dressed in mismatched uniforms that looked official at first glance, but carried no legitimacy upon closer inspection. Their badges were cheap plastic replicas, their holsters clumsy imitations of real law enforcement gear. But what unsettled Marcus was not their amateur costumes. It was the confidence with which they approached his door, as though certain that their presence alone was enough to intimidate. One of them raised a hand and pounded against the door. Boom, boom, boom. "Open up! HOA police! We need to speak with the homeowner immediately." Marcus set his coffee down slowly, his instincts sharpening. There was no such thing as HOA police. He knew it, and they surely knew it too. But the words weren't meant for accuracy. They were meant for intimidation. Naomi's voice carried from the staircase. "Marcus, who is it?" "Stay upstairs," he said calmly, his eyes never leaving the door. He didn't want his children anywhere near what was about to unfold. The pounding grew louder. "We know you're in there. Step outside before we force entry." Marcus rose from the table with the steady composure of a man who had walked into war zones and stared down some of the world's most ruthless criminals. But this was different. These weren't trained adversaries. These were imposters playing a dangerous game, emboldened by prejudice, ignorance, and the illusion of power. He opened the door just enough to step onto the porch, his broad shoulders filling the frame. The men squared up, clearly expecting fear. What they found instead was a quiet, commanding presence that unsettled them before he even spoke. "You've got about 3 seconds to explain why you're on my property, dressed like clowns, pretending to be law enforcement," Marcus said evenly, his voice low but lethal. The leader of the group smirked, though his eyes betrayed unease. "We've had complaints from the neighborhood, said you don't belong here, said you've been intimidating residents. We're here to take you in." Marcus tilted his head, studying them. He could hear the faint tremor in the man's voice, the way his hand rested nervously on his fake holster. These men weren't trained. They were opportunists, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. "You're trespassing," Marcus replied, "and you've got 2 choices. Leave this property right now, or learn the hard way what it means to impersonate federal authority." They laughed, trying to mask the sudden shift in energy. "What are you going to do? Call the cops? We are the cops." Marcus stepped forward, his gaze locking with the leaders until the man involuntarily shifted back. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Marcus said quietly, "but you're about to." Before they could respond, Marcus pulled his wallet from his back pocket and flipped it open. The gold badge glinted in the morning sun. Unmistakable, undeniable. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced, his voice cutting like steel. "And you're under arrest." The men froze, their confidence collapsing in an instant. The weight of reality crashed down on them. What had begun as an act of harassment, a performance of power meant to humiliate a black man in his own home, had turned into something far more terrifying. They hadn't just picked the wrong house. They had picked the house of the one man in the neighborhood they couldn't afford to cross. Marcus's training kicked in, his movements sharp and authoritative. Hands where I can see them. Now. The men obeyed, fumbling, their false bravado melting into panic. Naomi had appeared silently at the window, phone in hand, already calling the real police. Marcus moved swiftly, disarming the closest man, snapping the plastic badge from his chest, tossing it into the grass like the worthless trinket it was. "You think you can put on a costume and terrorize people?" Marcus's voice thundered. "You think my children should grow up watching their father harassed on his own front lawn? Not today. Not in my house." For years, Marcus had carried the weight of his community on his shoulders. He had seen how black men were criminalized for existing, how systems of power bent against them. He had lived it, endured it. But standing on that porch, holding a false enforcer by the collar, he was no longer just defending himself. He was defending the dignity of every black man who had been told they didn't belong, who had been targeted because of fear and ignorance. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second. The imposters shifted nervously, realizing their play acting was about to carry real consequences. Marcus kept his eyes on them, steady, unyielding. He wasn't just an agent of the law. He was the embodiment of a truth they could no longer deny. Black men were not victims waiting to be bullied. They were fathers, husbands, professionals, warriors, and in Marcus's case, one of the most feared and respected agents in the nation. As the police cars pulled into the cul-de-sac, neighbors peeked through blinds, shocked at the scene unfolding just steps from their driveways. Some had likely been the very voices whispering complaints that a man like him didn't belong here. But now, faced with the undeniable authority of his badge, those whispers would turn to silence. The officers stepped out, weapons drawn until Marcus raised his hand. "Stand down," he commanded. "FBI, these men are impersonating law enforcement. They attempted to arrest me on my own property." The real police quickly took control, cuffing the imposters who no longer resisted. Their faces burned with humiliation, their schemes shattered in the bright light of accountability. Naomi stepped onto the porch, her hand slipping into Marcus's. Their children watched from behind the safety of the glass door, their young faces pressed with questions too complex for their age. Marcus squeezed Naomi's hand gently, his chest heavy with both relief and anger, because beneath the victory of that moment lay a truth that cut deeper than any badge or uniform. If Marcus hadn't been an FBI agent, if he hadn't carried the authority to turn the tables, the outcome might have been very different. And that was the reality he could never ignore. The imposters were driven away in police cruisers, their heads lowered, their voices silent now. But the echoes of what had happened lingered long after the flashing lights disappeared down the street. The cul-de-sac, once so quiet, had turned into a stage where the harsh realities of race, power, and perception had been laid bare. Neighbors stepped outside hesitantly, some pretending to check their mail, others standing in small groups, whispering as though Marcus couldn't hear. Their eyes darted between him and the empty street where the sirens had faded. Marcus knew what they were thinking. Some were relieved justice had prevailed, others embarrassed that their neighborhood had been thrust into chaos. But there were also those who were disturbed, not by the imposters, but by the fact that Marcus had stood tall, unshaken, and in control. Naomi reached for his arm. "Come inside," she urged softly. "The kids don't need to see more of this." Marcus nodded, leading his family back into the safety of their home. But even inside, the weight of what had unfolded pressed down on him. He sat at the table again, the coffee now cold, and stared at the folder of case notes that only hours earlier had consumed his mind. How strange, he thought, that he could spend years dismantling the most dangerous networks in the country, yet find the gravest threat to his dignity standing outside his own front door, dressed in a Halloween costume of authority. His daughter, only 10 years old, slipped into the kitchen and stood by him. Her voice was quiet, curious. "Daddy, why did they want to take you?" Marcus looked into her wide, innocent eyes, struggling to find words gentle enough to shield her, yet honest enough to teach her. "Because some people don't understand who we are," he said finally. They look at the color of our skin and think it makes us less. They were wrong, and today they learned just how wrong. She nodded slowly, though her young mind could not fully grasp it. But she understood one thing. Her father was not afraid, and that she would remember. Later that evening, as the house settled into silence, Marcus sat with Naomi on the porch, the same porch where hours earlier men had tried to strip him of his dignity. The stars blinked overhead, indifferent yet eternal. Naomi placed her hand over his. "You should tell someone higher up," she said. "Not just the local police. This was more than harassment. This was a hate crime." Marcus exhaled, the air heavy in his chest. "I will," he said. "But you know what strikes me most? If I hadn't been who I am, if I didn't carry that badge, this could have gone another way. They could have forced their way in. They could have hurt us, and nobody would have believed me." Naomi's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. "That's what terrifies me." For Marcus, it was more than personal fear. It was a recognition of the broader truth. Across the country, Black men and women faced moments like this every day. Moments where authority was impersonated, where power was abused, where dignity was challenged. But not everyone had the shield of a federal badge to protect them. Not everyone had the leverage to turn an attack into a moment of reckoning. The following week, Marcus sat in a federal conference room, briefing senior officials. Photos of the fake uniforms lay scattered across the table. Reports from the local police detailed the charges: impersonation of law enforcement, attempted unlawful detention, harassment. Yet Marcus knew the crime was deeper than what paperwork could capture. "These men weren't just playing dress-up," he explained, his voice firm. "They were acting out a fantasy of control, a fantasy rooted in prejudice. They thought they could weaponize fear, that by calling themselves HOA police, they could erase my rights as a man, a homeowner, a father. And if they had succeeded, if I wasn't who I am, you wouldn't be reading a report. You'd be reading an obituary." The room fell silent. The weight of his words stretched across the polished oak table, pressing into the conscience of every official seated there. One agent cleared his throat, uneasy. "Marcus, do you believe this was an isolated act? Or do you think it reflects something larger?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "It reflects everything larger. It reflects the fact that in America, a Black man in his own home can still be seen as an intruder. It reflects the audacity of those who believe they can strip us of our humanity with intimidation. It reflects the truth that respect, safety, and dignity are still too often conditional. Conditional on titles, uniforms, and badges. And that has to change." The room shifted with discomfort, but no one challenged him. They couldn't. Marcus's life had been proof, lived in missions and in neighborhoods, in gunfights and in cul-de-sacs, that justice wasn't just something you enforced overseas or in the shadows of criminal empires. Justice had to live at home, on the front lawns of America. Word of the incident spread quietly through the bureau, through the neighborhood, and eventually through the wider community. Some tried to dismiss it as an isolated stunt. Others whispered in admiration, stunned at how Marcus had turned the tables on his aggressors. But within the Black community, the story resonated deeply. It was not just about one man's confrontation. It was about centuries of confrontation, distilled into a single morning. Marcus didn't seek the spotlight, but he couldn't escape the calls, the letters, the quiet nods of recognition when he walked into a church or grocery store. Men told him, "You stood up for all of us that day." Mothers thanked him for showing their children what courage looked like. Young boys stared wide-eyed at him, their imaginations sparked by the idea that strength could look like them. Still, Marcus carried it with the solemnity it deserved. He knew too well the danger of turning moments like these into spectacle. This wasn't entertainment. This was survival. Months later, as the trial for the imposters began, Marcus attended not as a victim, but as a witness. He watched the men who had once tried to intimidate him sit shackled, their heads bowed. He felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a quiet recognition of justice inching forward. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall in the courtroom. His words were not just for the judge or the jury, but for every ear that needed to hear them. I am not here today because of who I am as an FBI agent, he began. I am here because of who I am as a man, as a black man in America. What happened on my doorstep was not just an attempt to arrest me, it was an attempt to diminish me, to remind me that no matter my accomplishments, my skin would always be the first thing they saw. But let me be clear, I do not stand diminished. I stand unbroken. And I stand for every person who has been told they do not belong. His voice carried through the courtroom, steady and undeniable. Some jurors shifted in their seats, visibly moved. The judge, a woman seasoned in the law yet visibly touched, nodded with the solemn respect of someone who understood she was hearing more than testimony. She was hearing truth. When the trial concluded, the impostors were convicted. Their sentences were not long, but the message was clear. Authority cannot be faked. Justice cannot be mocked. And dignity, once challenged, will rise stronger. On the evening of the verdict, Marcus walked back to his porch, the same porch where it all began. His children played in the yard, laughter filling the air. Naomi sat nearby, her smile carrying both pride and relief. Marcus looked out at his neighborhood, the same lawns, the same houses, the same people, and felt something shift. The threat had not disappeared, nor had the prejudice, but something had been claimed that day, something permanent. It wasn't just his home, it wasn't just his title. It was his right to stand unafraid, his right to belong, his right to be. And though he knew the battles would continue, Marcus also knew this. Every time a man like him refused to bow, refused to shrink, refused to be diminished, another brick of injustice cracked, another chain loosened, another truth rose to the surface. So he sat on his porch, watching the sun dip low across the horizon, the flag above him swaying gently in the breeze. And with quiet strength, he whispered to himself, to his children, to his people. They tried to arrest me, but they couldn't arrest my dignity. Months passed, yet the memory of that Saturday morning clung to Marcus like a shadow. For him, it was never just about four imposters in fake uniforms. It was about what their presence revealed, that even in a cul-de-sac lined with picket fences and flower beds, prejudice could still come pounding on his door, demanding submission. Life in the neighborhood changed after that day. Some neighbors offered awkward smiles and stiff waves, gestures that felt less like friendliness and more like guilt. Others avoided eye contact altogether, embarrassed that such a thing had happened in their quiet enclave. And then there were a few who, in hushed tones, admitted they were grateful Marcus had stood tall, grateful he had not only defended his family, but also shown the entire neighborhood that intimidation had no place there. At home, his children struggled to make sense of what had happened. His daughter, still too young to grasp the full weight of racism, asked him more than once, "Daddy, why did they want to take you?" Each time, Marcus gave her the same steady answer. Because some people don't understand us. But that doesn't mean we stop being who we are. It means we stand taller. Slowly, his children began to carry the story not with fear, but with pride. In the bureau, whispers of the incident spread quickly. Colleagues who once saw Marcus only as a hardened field agent now saw him as something more. Someone who carried the realities of being black in America into spaces many preferred to ignore. Younger recruits sought him out, asking quietly, "What's it like, living with that kind of target, even when you're off duty?" Marcus answered them honestly, "It's like carrying weight you didn't choose. But the goal isn't to let it crush you. The goal is to make sure you carry it in a way that clears a path for those coming after you." The imposters who had tried to arrest him faded into the system. Their names didn't matter. Their sentences weren't long. They would serve time and eventually return to their lives. But their attempt left behind a story far larger than themselves. A story Marcus could not run from, because it had already begun to ripple through churches, barbershops, schools, and family gatherings. It wasn't about the men in fake uniforms. It was about the man who had refused to bow to them. Invitations began to arrive. Community centers wanted him to speak. Schools wanted him to mentor. Churches asked him to tell his story from the pulpit. At first, Marcus resisted. He wasn't a public figure. He was an agent. But Naomi urged him forward. "They need to hear it from you," she told him one evening. "Not the headlines, not rumors. The truth. Our children need to see that dignity isn't something they give you. It's something you claim." So Marcus spoke. and in gymnasiums and sanctuaries filled with young black faces, he told his story. Not to glorify himself, but to plant seeds. The badge on my chest doesn't make me strong, he told them. What makes me strong is knowing who I am before anyone tries to tell me otherwise. They couldn't strip me of my dignity because I never gave them that power. His words lit fires in hearts that had felt dimmed by the weight of prejudice. Parents came to him afterward, thanking him for reminding their children that strength could look like them. Elders clasped his hand, whispering, "You stood for all of us that day." Years later, the day on his porch had grown into almost a parable within the community. His son, now a teenager, once stood in a school assembly and declared, "My dad didn't just protect us. He showed the world we're not afraid." For Marcus, that moment meant more than any medal or commendation he'd ever received. As his career with the Bureau drew to a close, Marcus reflected not on the cartels dismantled or the terror networks disrupted, but on that single morning. On the truth it had taught him, that justice begins not in distant battlefields, but at your own doorstep. That dignity is not granted, it is defended. On his final day, standing before colleagues who had honored his service with awards and applause, Marcus chose his words carefully. "What I've learned," he said, "is that courage is not the absence of fear, it's the refusal to bow to it. They tried to arrest me on my own porch, but what they didn't know is that they could never arrest my dignity." The room rose in a standing ovation, but Marcus's eyes were on Naomi, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. She had walked beside him through every storm, and together they had built something no imposter could ever tear down: a home, a family, a legacy. That evening, as the sun set over the same porch where everything began, Marcus leaned back in his chair. His children, now older, played in the yard. His grandchildren laughed under the fading light. And as he watched them, his heart settled on the truth that had carried him through it all. They had tried to break him. They had tried to strip him. They had tried to arrest him. But instead, they had only proven the unshakable power of dignity. Dignity that could never be handcuffed, never be silenced, and never be erased. Retirement did not silence Marcus Reed. It amplified him. For years, his work as an FBI agent had forced him into shadows, where victories were measured in silence and sacrifices were hidden in sealed case files. But now, free from the obligations of secrecy, Marcus found a new mission: to turn his story into a beacon. Community organizations began inviting him not only to speak, but to lead. His name carried weight, not because of medals or titles, but because people knew his courage was not theoretical. It was lived. He had stared into the eyes of hate on his own doorstep, and he had not flinched. That kind of strength could not be taught from a textbook. It could only be embodied. Marcus launched a program he called the Front Porch Project. Its purpose was simple but profound: to teach young men and women of color how to stand firm in the face of intimidation, how to understand their rights, how to protect their dignity, and how to never confuse fear with weakness. "Your porch is your ground," Marcus would tell them. "It's where you decide whether you stand or bow. And when you stand, you're not standing for yourself alone. You're standing for everyone who comes after you." The project spread quickly from one city to another, supported by educators, activists, even faith leaders who saw in Marcus's story a rallying cry. Parents brought their children to hear him speak, hoping some of his strength would rub off. Schools played recordings of his talks, where his calm, measured voice reminded students that their worth could not be defined by anyone else's prejudice. But Marcus knew that inspiration alone was not enough. He worked with civil rights lawyers to develop workshops on how to identify police impersonators, how to respond safely to harassment, and how to hold systems accountable when they failed. He partnered with psychologists to create safe spaces for young people to talk about fear without shame. "Courage," he told them, "does not mean you never feel afraid. It means you don't let fear write your story." Naomi watched with quiet pride as her husband transformed from agent to mentor, from fighter to teacher. She often reminded him, "You've moved from protecting people with your badge to protecting them with your story." And sometimes that's the greater weapon. His children, now grown, carried his legacy forward in their own ways. His daughter studied law, determined to fight for systemic change. His son became a teacher, pouring strength into classrooms where young black boys too often doubted their future. They carried his name not as a burden, but as a banner. But legacy is not built without resistance. For every person who celebrated Marcus, there were others who resented him. Hate mail arrived at his home, letters dripping with the same venom that had once walked up his driveway in counterfeit uniforms. Anonymous voices online called him a fraud, accused him of exaggeration, tried to rewrite his story as one of arrogance instead of survival. Marcus never replied. He didn't need to. Their anger only proved the power of his truth. He knew hate always screamed loudest when it felt threatened. And what he carried, dignity, courage, legacy, was the greatest threat of all. One evening, years after his retirement, Marcus was invited to give the keynote address at a national civil rights conference. The room was filled with leaders, scholars, activists, and families whose lives had been touched by injustice. He stood on the stage, the lights bright on his face, the silence of anticipation heavy in the air. "They came to my porch to arrest me," he began. "But what they didn't know was that they were standing on my ground. They thought they were strong, but strength is not in numbers, or in costumes, or in borrowed authority. Strength is knowing who you are when the world tells you you're nothing. That day, I did not just defend my home. I defended my right to exist with dignity." The room erupted in applause, but Marcus lifted his hand, asking for quiet. "I don't stand here as a hero," he continued. "I stand here as a man who refuses to bow. And my hope, my prayer, is that every person here today leaves with the same refusal. Because dignity is not mine alone. It is ours, and it must never be surrendered." The audience rose to their feet, many with tears streaming down their cheeks. For some, Marcus's words reopened wounds they had buried. For others, they planted new courage. But for all, they were a reminder that dignity, once claimed, could never be arrested. As the years went on, Marcus became not just a name, but a symbol. His story was taught in classrooms, his speeches quoted in sermons, his example invoked whenever communities faced intimidation. And though time grayed his hair and slowed his step, his presence remained unshakable. He was no longer just the man on the porch. He was the living reminder that Black dignity was stronger than fear, stronger than hate, stronger than any imposter in any uniform. On his 75th birthday, surrounded by family, Marcus sat again on the porch where it all began. Children laughed in the yard, neighbors waved from across the street, and Naomi sat beside him, her hand in his. He watched the sun sink into the horizon, painting the sky in deep, steady colors. And in that moment, he understood the full circle of his journey. The porch was no longer a place of confrontation. It was a place of peace. Not because the world had fully changed, but because he had lived long enough to plant seeds of change in others. "They tried to arrest me once," Marcus said softly, almost to himself. "But all they did was teach me how powerful it is to stand." Naomi squeezed his hand. His children smiled knowingly. His grandchildren played on the grass, their laughter the sweetest proof of all. And Marcus Reed leaned back, content. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew the next generation was already standing where he once stood, strong, unbroken, and unafraid. Time, relentless as ever, eventually began to claim what even Marcus's courage could not resist. His step grew slower, his voice quieter, his hair fully silver. Yet even as age bent his frame, it could not touch his spirit. To his family, neighbors, and community, Marcus was not just a man. He was a living monument to resilience. Universities invited him to share his story, and while he once spoke with thunder, he now spoke with the soft authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. Students leaned forward in packed auditoriums, hanging on every word, not because he told them what they wanted to hear, but because he spoke what they needed to remember. The world will try to tell you who you are. Don't ever let their voices drown out your own. You decide your name. You decide your dignity. Naomi remained his steadfast partner, her presence a quiet reminder that love is also resistance. Their evenings often ended with the two of them on the same porch where everything had begun, watching children ride bikes down the street, watching the neighborhood evolve. Sometimes Marcus would laugh at the irony. "All that danger came walking up this porch," he'd say, "and yet here we are, still here, still standing. But the story of Marcus Reed was too large to remain only on one porch. Documentaries were made, books were written, and civil rights historians began citing his confrontation with the fake HOA police as a pivotal moment in modern Black history, a moment where private courage became public testimony. His name appeared in classrooms, alongside the names of leaders and activists who had faced injustice and transformed it into strength. Marcus never chased recognition. In fact, he often shrugged it off. "I didn't do anything anyone else couldn't do," he told his children. But his humility only deepened the respect people felt for him. He hadn't stood his ground to be celebrated. He had done it because surrender was never an option. Inevitably, the day came when Marcus's body could no longer hold his spirit. Surrounded by family, he passed quietly, his hand resting in Naomi's, his breath fading like a final whisper. The news spread quickly, carried not by headlines alone, but by word of mouth, by the hearts of people who had been changed by his story. Vigils lit up across neighborhoods, churches, and campuses. Strangers left flowers on porches, not just his, but their own, as if to honor the ground he had taught them to claim. At his funeral, the church overflowed. Law enforcement officials, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens filled every pew. Outside, hundreds more stood shoulder to shoulder, holding candles, holding signs, holding silence. His daughter spoke first. Her voice was steady, though her eyes were wet. "My father was the strongest man I ever knew, but his strength wasn't in his fists, or his badge, or even his mind. His strength was in how he refused to let hate define him. He taught me and all of us that dignity is not something anyone can give or take away. It is who you are when the world tries to strip everything else." When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet in the thunderous applause, not out of habit but out of necessity, as though silence could not hold the weight of their gratitude. Later, as the casket was lowered into the earth, Naomi whispered words only she and Marcus would ever know. And though her heart ached, she felt no defeat, because Marcus's life had not ended in that moment. It had multiplied. It lived in the people he had inspired, in the children who had grown up braver because of him, in the students who carried his lessons into their futures, in the neighborhoods that refused to bow. Months later, a new building was unveiled in the city, the Marcus Reed Center for Justice and Dignity. Its walls bore his quotes. Its halls hosted programs he had once dreamed of. Its doors opened to everyone who needed guidance, safety, or strength. On the front lawn stood a bronze statue of Marcus, not in uniform, not in a pose of aggression, but standing tall, hands at his side, eyes forward, as though he were simply waiting for someone to join him on the porch. Children on field trips touched the statue's base as teachers told them, "This is a man who showed the world that dignity can't be arrested." Families visited to take photos, not out of tourism, but out of reverence. Activists gathered there before marches, as though drawing courage from his memory. And in every whispered story, Marcus lived again. Naomi, now older herself, often visited the center. She would sit quietly in the lobby, listening to the voices of young people rehearsing speeches, lawyers preparing workshops, teachers planning lessons. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she wept. Always, she felt proud. Years later, when historians wrote about Marcus Reed, they did not describe him as just an FBI agent or just a man confronted by imposters on his porch. They described him as a bridge between fear and courage, between humiliation and dignity, between silence and voice. And so, even after his passing, Marcus's life became more than memory. It became legacy. His story was no longer about one man. It was about a people who refused to bow, about a fight that stretched across generations, about the eternal truth that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken. Because in the end, Marcus Reed did not just survive injustice, he transformed it. He turned his porch into a pulpit, his life into a lesson, his struggle into a seed. And from that seed grew a forest of strength, so vast that no storm of hatred could ever uproot it. Stories end, but legacies never do. Marcus Reed's life is proof. His story began on a quiet porch with a knock at the door, but it did not finish there. That porch became a symbol, a reminder that Black life has always been tested at thresholds, doorways of justice, of opportunity, of survival. What he faced was not unique to him alone, but his answer to it made his life unforgettable. For centuries, black men and women have been met with the counterfeit power of prejudice. People dressing themselves in false authority, armed with lies, intimidation, or even law twisted out of justice. Marcus's confrontation with the fake HOA police was just one chapter in a much older book, one that stretches back to shackles and chains, to laws written not to protect but to control, to generations told they could not stand tall. But Marcus showed what happens when someone refuses to bend. He did not just survive the night they came for him. He reversed the story. Instead of being humiliated, he revealed their fraud. Instead of being silenced, he made the world listen. Instead of shrinking, he grew larger than the lies meant to contain him. His dignity stood taller than their disguise. And that is what makes his life resonate even now. Every time a black man is stopped on a street for fitting a description, Marcus's story echoes. Every time a black woman is overlooked for the work she built with her own hands, his story answers back. Every time a young black child wonders if their voice matters in a world that too often tries to quiet them, his story whispers, yes, you matter. Stand tall. The world changes slowly, but it changes. Marcus's legacy is proof that a single act of defiance can ripple outward, reshaping how others see themselves. He did not just protect his home that night, he protected the possibility of dignity for countless others who would hear his name. And even now, long after he has gone, his life continues to shield, to guide, to teach. But Marcus's story is also a challenge. Because dignity is not inherited, it must be defended again and again. The fight is not over. The faces of injustice may change. The uniforms may look different. But the impulse to control, to demean, to erase remains alive in corners of society. Which means the courage Marcus carried must also remain alive in us. It is easy to revere heroes when they are gone. It is harder to live by their example while they are alive inside of us. Marcus would not have wanted statues or ceremonies if they were not matched by action. He would not have wanted his name praised if his principles were forgotten. He would have wanted each person who heard his story to ask, what will I do when it is my porch, when it is my threshold, when it is my dignity on the line? Perhaps that is the truest ending to his story, not an ending at all, but a beginning for each of us. Marcus Reed reminds us that resistance is not always a march in the streets or a courtroom battle. Sometimes it is as simple and as profound as refusing to let anyone redefine who you are. Sometimes it is the courage to stand where you are planted and say, no further, not here, not to me. So as the candles dim at his memorial, as the bronze statue gleams beneath the morning sun, as children touch his name and ask their parents who he was, Marcus's voice still travels through the air. It does not command like an agent, nor thunder like a protest, but it speaks with the quiet certainty of truth. You are not powerless. You are not invisible. You are not defined by the lies of those who fear your strength. You are who you decide to be. Stand tall. Claim your ground. Your dignity cannot be arrested. And in that voice, in that echo, Marcus Reed lives forever. This is the end of his story, but it is also the start of yours.